My wife is convinced that I am an imposter. She truly, deeply believes that the man living in her house, sleeping in her bed, and eating at her table is a fabricated replica of her husband. Please, if anyone is reading this, I need help. I feel like I am losing my mind. I know how utterly insane this sounds. I know it sounds like the plot of a cheap late-night thriller, but I swear to you, this is my reality, and it is tearing me apart. I need to start from the beginning. I have to put this down in writing, if only to prove to myself that the beautiful life we had wasn't just a hallucination. I met my wife, Sylvia, 6 years ago. We live in a secluded, heavily wooded suburb just outside of Denver, Colorado. Our house is an old, rustic A-frame cabin surrounded by towering pine trees, trees that look like silent sentinels in the heavy winter snow. I have always worked as an antique book restorer. It is a quiet, solitary profession. I spend my days in my home office, surrounded by the smell of decaying leather, parchment, and binding glue, painstakingly repairing the spines of forgotten literature. Sylvia is a botanist and a florist. She runs a small, independent nursery in town, but her true passion is the massive, glass-paned greenhouse she built attached to the back of our cabin. Before I met her, my life was a gray, monotonous routine. I was a man perfectly content to fade into the background. But Sylvia, she was a force of nature. She was vibrant, fiercely intelligent, and possessed a warmth that could melt the bitterest Colorado freeze. She brought color into my world. We didn't lead an extravagant life, but it was profoundly peaceful. Our evenings were spent by the stone fireplace, a blanket draped over our laps, a glass of cheap red wine in our hands, listening to the crackle of the burning cedar. We would talk for hours about the most trivial things, the shape of the clouds, the intricate root systems of her orchids, the history hidden within the pages of the books I restored. We were a team. We were an impenetrable unit. I loved her with a ferocity that frightened me, and I knew she felt the same. The nightmare began approximately 3 months ago. It did not happen overnight. It was not a sudden, dramatic shift that I could immediately point to and say, that is when it broke. It was an insidious, creeping rot that slowly infected our home. It started with the insomnia. Sylvia, who usually slept so soundly that a thunderstorm wouldn't wake her, began to toss and turn. I would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning to find the space beside me empty. I would wander out into the living room and find her sitting in the dark, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring blankly out the frost-covered window. When I asked her what was wrong, she would force a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just stressed about the nursery," she would say, her voice hollow. "The winter freeze is threatening the imported ferns. Just go back to bed, Nathan." But it wasn't the ferns. Over the next few weeks, her behavior grew increasingly erratic. The physical distance between us widened into a chasm. She stopped holding my hand when we walked down the driveway to check the mail. She stopped resting her head on my shoulder during movies. If I walked into the kitchen and brushed past her to reach the coffee pot, she would flinch. Her shoulders would stiffen, as if I had pressed a hot iron against her bare skin. Then came the staring. I would be sitting at my workbench, carefully applying adhesive to a fragile 19th century binding, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. I would turn around, and Sylvia would be standing in the doorway. She wasn't just looking at me, she was dissecting me. Her eyes, usually a warm, inviting amber, were narrowed, cold, and calculating. She was scanning the geometry of my face, the slope of my shoulders, the specific way my hands moved over the paper. The moment I caught her eye, she would blink, the coldness instantly vanishing, replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy, and she would quickly retreat to her greenhouse. The air in the house became suffocatingly thick. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. I tried to talk to her. I begged her to tell me what was going on. I suggested we see a therapist, a doctor, anyone. She vehemently refused, her voice rising to a panicked shriek, accusing me of trying to gaslight her into thinking she was crazy. And then she started testing me. I didn't realize it was a test until much later, but looking back, the signs were blindingly obvious. The first major incident occurred at the dinner table. Ever since I was a child, I have had a severe, almost phobic aversion to mushrooms. The texture, the taste, the smell, it makes me violently gag. Sylvia knew this. In 6 years of marriage, she had never cooked a single dish containing them. But one snowy Tuesday evening, she set a steaming bowl of risotto in front of me. I was exhausted from a long day of tedious repair work. I didn't look closely at the food. I just picked up my spoon and began to eat while I talked about a difficult client. I ate half the bowl before I looked up and saw Sylvia staring at me from across the table. Her face was entirely drained of blood. Her hands were gripping the edge of the wooden table so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. "What's wrong?" I asked, my mouth full. Her voice was a fragile, terrifying whisper. "Nathan, that is a wild mushroom and truffle risotto. You just ate half of it." I froze, the spoon halfway to my mouth. I looked down at the bowl. It was packed with thick, dark slices of portobello and cremini mushrooms. I hadn't noticed. I hadn't tasted them. I hadn't gagged. I tried to laugh it off. I claimed that my taste buds must be changing as I got older, or that her cooking was just so incredible it masked the texture. Sylvia didn't laugh. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "You hate mushrooms, Nathan. You throw up if you even smell them cooking." She backed away from the table, her eyes wide with a terror I could not comprehend. She turned and locked herself in the guest bedroom for the rest of the night. 2 days later, the second test occurred. The old boiler in our basement has a habit of shutting down when the temperature drops below zero. The basement is a damp, cavernous space, poorly lit and filled with claustrophobic winding pipes. I have severe claustrophobia, stemming from a childhood incident where I was locked in a dark utility closet for hours. Going down into that basement, especially when the power trips and it is pitch black, induces severe panic attacks. Sylvia has always been the one to go down with a flashlight and reset the pilot light. That Thursday, the heat cut out. The house was freezing. Sylvia was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. "The boiler is out," she said. Her tone was completely flat, devoid of her usual willingness to help. Without thinking, I stood up, walked to the basement door, and opened it. I descended the wooden stairs into the pitch-black darkness. I navigated the tight, winding corridor of pipes purely by memory, found the heavy iron boiler, reached blindly for the reset switch, and ignited the pilot light. The basement hummed back to life. I walked back upstairs, dusting off my hands. Sylvia was standing at the top of the stairs. She looked like she had seen a ghost. "You didn't take the flashlight," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You hate the dark. You can't breathe down there. You always hyperventilate." I tried to explain that I was just too cold to wait, that I just wanted to get it done quickly. But the words sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Why hadn't I panicked? Why hadn't my chest tightened? I didn't have an answer. The climax of her silent investigation happened exactly 1 week ago. I decided to feign sleep. I lay in our bed, facing the wall, keeping my breathing slow and steady, mimicking the deep rhythm of REM sleep. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:14 a.m. The house was dead silent, save for the howling wind outside. I heard the gentle creak of the bedroom door opening. Soft, deliberate footsteps crossed the carpet. The mattress dipped slightly behind me. The air grew freezing cold. I could feel her presence looming over my back. I felt a small, cold metal object, perhaps a ruler or a measuring tape, gently press against the space between my shoulder blades. Then I heard her whisper. It was a voice full of devastating grief and absolute certainty. "The crescent is gone. He doesn't have the crescent." She traced a finger over the smooth skin of my left shoulder blade. "Nathan had a birthmark here, a dark brown crescent moon. I used to kiss it every night. Your skin is flawless. You are a flawless, empty shell." I squeezed my eyes shut, a tear leaking onto my pillow. What crescent? I had never had a birthmark on my back. I would know my own body. I wanted to scream, to sit up and shake her, to demand she stop this madness. But the absolute heartbreak in her voice paralyzed me. I lay perfectly still until she finally stood up and walked out of the room. The next morning, Sylvia left for the nursery early. The moment I heard her car pull out of the driveway, I snapped. I could no longer live in this state of psychological torture. I needed to know what was fueling her delusion. I began to tear the house apart. I searched the bedroom, her closet, the kitchen drawers, pulling out papers and overturning boxes. I found nothing. Desperate, I walked out to the attached greenhouse. The air was thick and humid, smelling of damp soil and blooming orchids. I moved toward her potting bench in the back corner. Tucked beneath a heavy bag of fertilizer, I found a heavy, dark green metal lockbox. I grabbed a pair of heavy pruning shears from the bench and smashed the lock until it snapped off. I flipped the lid open. Inside was a horrifying archive of my own existence. There was a thick, leather-bound scrapbook. I opened it and my stomach violently dropped. It was filled with dozens of Polaroid photographs of me. Photos of me eating, reading, working, and sleeping. But it wasn't just photos. She had taken a red permanent marker and drawn meticulous circles and lines across my face. She had mapped the distance between my eyes, the angle of my jaw, the specific way my lips parted when I breathed. Next to the photos were pages and pages of her frantic, jagged handwriting. Day 42. He is adjusting well to the environment, but the programming is flawed. The dietary restrictions were not uploaded. He consumed the toxins without biological rejection. Why did they send a model with incomplete parameters? I flipped the page, my hands shaking so violently I nearly tore the paper. Day 55. The phobia protocols are missing. He navigated the subterranean sector in absolute darkness. The original Nathan would have experienced a spike in cortisol levels, resulting in a localized panic response. This unit feels no fear. It is a machine wearing my husband's skin. I am sleeping next to a synthetic mimic. My breath caught in my throat. Synthetic mimic? Programming? Was she experiencing a schizophrenic break? At the bottom of the box was a small, digital voice recorder. I pressed play. The audio was static heavy, but Sylvia's voice came through, cold and clinical. The physical discrepancies are confirming my hypothesis. The epidermal layer is too perfect. The cellular blemishes, specifically the crescent pigmentation on the left dorsal region, have not been replicated. The creators focused on behavioral mimicking, but failed at microanatomy. I cannot sustain this observation period much longer. The proximity to the imposter is causing severe psychological distress. If the real Nathan is dead, I must terminate the replica. I cannot let this thing walk the earth wearing his face. I dropped the recorder. It clattered against the concrete floor of the greenhouse. Terminate the replica. She was planning to kill me. My own wife, the woman I loved more than life itself, believed I was a manufactured monster and was planning my execution. I didn't have time to process the horror. The heavy wooden door connecting the greenhouse to the cabin swung open. Sylvia stood in the doorway. She had come home early. She looked at the smashed lockbox. She looked at the Polaroids scattered across the potting bench. She looked at me. There was no shock on her face. There was no fear. There was only a cold, terrifying resolve. "You shouldn't have opened that," she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "Sylvia, please," I begged, taking a step backward, my hands raised in surrender. "Look at me. Look into my eyes. I am Nathan. I am the man who married you. I am not a machine. I am not a replica. You are sick. You need help. And I want to help you." Sylvia reached out and picked up a heavy, rusted gardening sickle from the tool rack by the door. "Nathan is dead," she whispered. "You are just a glitch in their system." She lunged at me with a speed and ferocity I didn't know she possessed. I tried to dodge, throwing my arm up to protect my face. The rusted blade of the sickle tore through the thick fabric of my flannel shirt, biting deeply into the flesh and muscle of my left shoulder. A blinding, white-hot agony exploded through my body. I screamed, stumbling backward, crashing into a wooden table of potted ferns. Ceramic shattered against the concrete. I fell to the floor, clutching my bleeding shoulder. Blood, hot and red, poured through my fingers, pooling on the floor of the greenhouse. Sylvia stood over me, the bloody sickle gripped tightly in her hand. Her chest was heaving. "Why are you bleeding?" she asked. Her voice cracked, a sudden flicker of confusion breaking through her cold facade. "They said the synthetics wouldn't bleed." "Because I am human!" I screamed, choking on my own tears and the blinding pain. "I am your husband." She raised the sickle again, her hands shaking violently. She looked at the blood on her hands, then at my face. She let out a horrific, guttural wail of absolute despair, dropped the weapon, and ran out of the greenhouse. I heard the front door of the cabin slam shut, followed by the roar of her car engine speeding away down the snowy driveway. I dragged myself into the kitchen, leaving a trail of blood across the floor, and managed to dial 911 before the blood loss caused the world to fade into a heavy, suffocating darkness. I woke up in the stark, blinding white light of a hospital room. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor filled the silence. My left shoulder was heavily bandaged, a dull, throbbing ache radiating down my arm. I tried to sit up, but my body felt incredibly heavy. A man in a cheap brown suit was sitting in the plastic chair beside my bed. He had a weary, lined face and a notebook resting on his knee. "Take it easy, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I'm Detective Donovan, Denver PD. You've lost a lot of blood, but the doctors say you're going to pull through. The sickle missed the major arteries." I let my head fall back against the pillow. "My wife, Sylvia." "We're looking for her," Donovan said, his expression grim. "We found the greenhouse. We found the box, the photos, the recorder. It looks like a severe case of Capgras delusion. It's a psychological condition where the patient believes their loved one has been replaced by an identical imposter. It usually stems from a brain injury or severe trauma, but sometimes it just happens. We've got state troopers looking for her vehicle. We will find her." I closed my eyes, a tear slipping down my cheek. She thought I was a machine. She thought I was built in a lab. It's so insane. Donovan nodded sympathetically, closing his notebook. "It is a tragedy, Mr. Vance. It truly is. But you're safe now. Just rest. Focus on your recovery. When you get out of here, you should take some time off. You've been through hell. Maybe get out of the city for a while. Hell, when you're healed up, we should go up into the Rockies. Do some hunting like we talked about last summer at the precinct barbecue. Bring that custom Winchester rifle of yours." I opened my eyes and looked at the detective. I felt a strange, jarring friction in my brain. "I don't hunt, detective," I said, my voice hoarse. "I despise firearms. And I couldn't shoot a rifle anyway. I'm legally blind in my right eye. A childhood accident. I've told you that." Detective Donovan froze. The sympathetic warmth vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of profound, guarded shock. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. He didn't say a word. He slowly stood up, backed away from the bed, and walked out of the room, letting the heavy door click shut behind him. The silence in the hospital room became deafening. A cold, creeping dread began to spread through my veins, far worse than the pain in my shoulder. I slowly pushed myself up, ignoring the agonizing pull of my stitches. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and walked unsteadily toward the small mirror mounted above the sink in the corner of the room. I stared at my pale, exhausted reflection. I looked at my right eye. I slowly raised my trembling left hand and covered my left eye. I looked at the bathroom tiles. I looked at the sink. I looked at the reflection of the hospital bed behind me. I could see perfectly. My vision in my right eye was crystal clear, sharp, and entirely unimpaired. I had never had a childhood accident. I was not legally blind. I lowered my hand, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The reflection in the mirror stared back at me, a stranger wearing my face. And then, the memories began to slip. I tried to picture my workbench at the cabin. I tried to remember the smell of the leather bindings, the specific technique I used to repair the spine of a 19th century novel. But the images were dissolving, like sugar in boiling water. The smell of the old parchment was fading, replaced by the sharp, sterile scent of ozone and cooling fans. The image of the workbench vanished entirely. Instead, a new memory violently forced its way into my consciousness. I saw lines of complex, glowing blue code cascading across a massive, curved monitor. I saw myself typing furiously on a mechanical keyboard in a sterile, windowless office high above the streets of Chicago. I wasn't an antique book restorer. I was a senior software engineer. I had never repaired a book in my life. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink to keep from collapsing as the architecture of my entire reality began to collapse inward. The terrifying, undeniable truth washed over me. A truth far more horrifying than anything Sylvia had written in her journals. Sylvia wasn't suffering from Capgras delusion. She wasn't crazy. The real question isn't whether she will ever find her husband again. The real question is, whose memories are currently being erased from my hard drive, and who is the man they modeled my face after? My name is Julian Vance. If you look through the municipal records of industrial accidents in Boston, Massachusetts, you will find my name tucked away in a dusty file from 2022. The entry is brief. It states that a site foreman fell 4 stories when a structural beam collapsed at the Harborside Development Project. It mentions a severed spinal cord, permanent paralysis from the waist down, and a substantial, private, out-of-court settlement paid by the parent company, Apex Foundations. Part of that settlement was a ground-floor apartment in a quiet, brick-faced complex called Willow Creek Manor. It was owned by the company, a jest of goodwill, they said. A place where I could recover in peace, away from the prying eyes of the world, and away from the lawyers. I lived in Unit 102 for nearly a year, and for 300 days, I didn't know I was living in a ghost. Recovery is a slow, agonizing process, not just for the body, but for the mind. When you are a man who spent his life climbing steel skeletons and commanding crews of 100 men, and suddenly you are confined to a wheelchair in a windowless living room, something inside you snaps. Depression didn't just visit me, it moved in. I stopped leaving the apartment after the second month. The hollow oak gardens they promised turned out to be a sterile, beige-walled prison. My groceries were delivered to the doorstep by a service I never saw. My physical therapist, a man named Dr. Sterling, stopped coming after the 6-month mark, claiming the company had adjusted my recovery plan to focus on home-based self-care. I became a ghost in my own life. I spent my days staring at the flickering shadows on the ceiling, and my nights listening to the life happening around me. The walls of Unit 102 were surprisingly thin. At first, I hated it. I hated the intrusion of other people's lives. But as the months of isolation dragged on, those sounds became my only anchor to reality. I began to map the building through my ears. I knew my neighbors better than I knew my own reflection. Every morning at exactly 7:42 a.m., a child in the apartment directly above me would start playing. I could hear the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a rubber ball bouncing on the hardwood floor. It was a happy sound. It told me the world was waking up. At 1:15 p.m., the radio lady in Unit 103 to my left would turn on her stereo. She listened to a local talk radio station. The host had a deep, booming voice that vibrated through my kitchen wall. I couldn't hear the words, just the cadence of his speech, followed by a specific jingle for a carpet cleaning company. At 6 p.m., the coughing man in Unit 101 to my right would return home. I would hear the heavy scrape of his deadbolt, the groan of his front door, and then a deep, wet, chest-rattling cough that lasted for nearly 30 seconds, every night, without fail. And at 11:30 p.m., right as I was trying to find a comfortable position in my medical bed, a cat would meow outside my door. Not a soft meow, but a long, mournful cry that echoed down the hallway, 3 times. Meow, meow, meow. These were the pillars of my existence. They were the evidence that I wasn't the last man on Earth. But then, the insomnia took a darker turn. It was the 8th month of my isolation. I had been awake for nearly 48 hours, fueled by caffeine and the phantom pains in my dead legs. The silence of the apartment was ringing in my ears. It was 1:15 p.m. I leaned my head against the wall of Unit 103, waiting for the radio lady. The talk radio host's voice began to rumble, the same deep, booming tone. I closed my eyes, letting the vibration soothe me. Then the jingle started. Brightwash carpets for a life that's clean. Call 555-0199 and join the team. My eyes flew open. I had heard that jingle every day for 6 months, but this time something was different. The singer's voice hitched at the exact same moment it had hitched yesterday. A slight, static-like pop occurred right before the second 5 in the phone number. I grabbed my tablet. I had started recording my audio diaries to help with my cognitive therapy. I found the recording from 2 days ago. I played them both at the same time. The audio files aligned perfectly. The static pop, the singer's hitch, the host's intake of breath. It wasn't just the same radio show. It was the same exact broadcast. Panic, cold and sharp, began to bloom in my chest. I waited. I stayed awake until 6 p.m. I rolled my wheelchair to the door of Unit 101. Scrape, groan, cough. I looked at my watch. It was 6 p.m. exactly. The cough was identical. The same 3 hacks, followed by a sharp inhale, followed by 2 smaller coughs. It was a loop. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the front door, my hands trembling on the wheels of my chair. I waited for the cat. 11:30 p.m. Meow, meow, meow. The meows were perfectly timed. The same pitch, the same duration. I realized then, with a horror that made my skin feel like it was crawling with ants, that I hadn't heard a new sound in 8 months. I had been living inside a recording. I rolled to my kitchen drawers and grabbed a heavy, serrated bread knife. If the company thought they could keep me in a box, if they thought they could simulate a life for me to keep me quiet, they were wrong. I approached the wall separating me from the radio lady. I started to dig. I am a construction man. I know how walls are built. Drywall, studs, insulation. It should have taken effort, but the bread knife sliced through the wall like it was made of damp cardboard. There were no studs. There was no insulation. I peeled back a large square of the beige wallpaper, expecting to see into Unit 103. Instead, I saw a wall of cold, gray, industrial steel. Mounted to the steel were dozens of small, high-fidelity speakers. They were wired into a central conduit that ran up into the ceiling. A small red LED light on the speaker housing blinked. Once. Twice. Thrice. My apartment wasn't part of a building. It was a freestanding, fabricated room, a stage set, constructed inside a larger metallic structure. I turned my chair toward the front door, the door I hadn't opened in nearly a year. I reached for the handle. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it was painful. I pushed down. The door didn't just open, it slid sideways into the wall with a soft pneumatic hiss. I rolled out into the hallway. It was a nightmare of liminality. The hallway was impossibly long, stretching out into a vanishing point that the dim yellow fluorescent lights couldn't reach. The carpet was a sickening shade of moss green. The walls were lined with doors, hundreds of them, all labeled Unit 102. "Hello?" I screamed. My voice didn't echo. It was swallowed by the carpet, deadened and flat. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Then I heard it. The sound of a door opening somewhere in the distance. I looked down the infinite hallway. A figure stepped out of one of the doors. It was a man. He was wearing a gray maintenance uniform, but as he stepped under the flickering light, I saw his face, or rather, the lack of one. His features were blurred, like a photograph taken with a shaky hand. Where his eyes should have been, there were only smudges of gray shadow. His mouth was a static-filled slit. Then another door opened. A woman stepped out. She looked just like the man, blurred, incomplete, a placeholder for a person. They didn't speak. They didn't run. They just began to walk toward me, their footsteps making no sound on the green carpet. From the ceiling speakers, the sounds began to play, all at once, at a deafening volume. The bouncy ball, the radio jingle, the coughing, the cat. Thump, brightwash, cough, meow. The sounds were distorted, slowed down until they were demonic growls. I spun my wheelchair around, heading for the only thing that looked different, a heavy, red-lit exit door at the very end of the corridor. I pushed my wheels with the strength I didn't know I had. My arms burned. My lungs felt like they were on fire. Behind me, the blurred figures were picking up speed. They didn't have legs that moved normally. They glided, their bodies flickering like a bad television signal. I reached the red door. I smashed the push bar with my chest and tumbled through. I fell. I didn't fall onto a street. I didn't fall into a parking lot. I tumbled down a steep, rocky embankment, my wheelchair somersaulting over me, crushing my useless legs as I rolled into a ditch filled with stagnant, freezing water. I lay there, gasping, the rain soaking through my thin, hospital-issued pajamas. I looked back. There was no Willow Creek Manor. There was only a massive, rusted, windowless, corrugated metal warehouse sitting in the middle of a vast, empty salt marsh on the edge of the city. The red exit door was a small, insignificant hatch in the side of the enormous structure. I saw the blurred figures standing in the doorway. They didn't follow me out into the rain. They just stood there, watching, their static faces flickering in the darkness. Then, the hatch closed. I spent 3 days in that ditch before a highway patrol officer spotted my wreckage from the nearby overpass. I woke up in a state-run hospital, not a company-owned one, a real, smelling of bleach and misery hospital. When I told the police about Apex Foundations, they looked at me with pity. "Mr. Vance," the detective said, his voice soft, "Apex Foundations went bankrupt in 2021. The Harborside project was never completed. The land was sold to the city for a wildlife preserve." "But the apartment," I whispered. "The settlement." "I lived there for a year." The detective shook his head. "We checked the GPS on your phone, Julian. It hasn't moved from that warehouse in 8 months. But that warehouse, it's been a condemned Superfund site since the 90s. There's no power, no water, no residents." "I heard them!" I screamed, grabbing his sleeve. "I heard the cat! I heard the radio!" The detective gently pried my hand away. "There were no speakers found in that building, Julian. It was just an empty shell. Just rusted girders and old construction waste." I wanted to call him a liar. I wanted to tell him he was part of the conspiracy. But then, I looked at my wheelchair. The police had recovered it from the ditch. It was mangled, the metal frame twisted. I looked at the wheels. Caught in the spokes was a piece of the hallway carpet, a small, jagged strip of moss-green fabric. I picked it up. It didn't feel like carpet. It didn't feel like fabric. It felt like plastic. It felt like the material they use to make cheap, disposable toys. And as I held it in my hand, it began to fade. The color drained away, becoming a dull, translucent gray. The texture vanished, becoming smooth and featureless. Within minutes, the piece of the building was gone. It had simply de-rezzed, leaving nothing but a faint smell of ozone in my palm. The police think I had a psychotic break brought on by trauma and morphine. They think I wandered into a warehouse and hallucinated a life to survive the isolation. But I know the truth. I know that the world is a construction site. I know that sometimes the builders get lazy. They leave a box in a warehouse. They play a recording. They put a placeholder in a uniform. And now, every time I hear a cat meow, or a neighbor cough, or a radio jingle, I stop, I listen, and I wait for the static to bleed through the air. My name is Rhiannon. I am a mother, and I am currently writing this from a cramped, low-rent motel room somewhere on the outskirts of Charleston. My hands are shaking so violently I can barely hold my phone, and I find myself unable to stop staring at the thin gap beneath the door, waiting for the shadows to move. They say children have overactive imaginations. They tell you that when a child draws a monster, it's just their way of processing the world's complexities. But what do you do when the drawings start to change? What do you do when the monster in the charcoal sketches starts dictating the reality of your home? It started 3 weeks ago in our house in Savannah. It's an old Victorian on a street lined with weeping willows and Spanish moss, a place that always felt a little too heavy with history. My 7-year-old son, Silas, has always been a quiet boy. He's an artist, the kind who can spend an entire rainy afternoon on the hardwood floor with a stack of paper and a box of dull, broken crayons. The first time I saw the figure, I didn't think much of it. I thought it was a phase. A dark one, perhaps, but just a phase. "Who is this, Silas?" I asked one afternoon, picking up a drawing from the coffee table. It was drawn with an aggressive hand, using deep charcoal grays and blacks. The figure was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs were thin and jagged, like the limbs of a dead oak tree. It had no eyes, just 2 smooth, blank patches of pale skin where a gaze should be. But the mouth was a wide, jagged slit that stretched almost to its ears. "That's the Weaver," Silas said, his voice flat, not looking up from his current page. "The Weaver? That's a heavy name for a drawing, Silas. Does he have a story?" Silas stopped his hand. He looked up at me with an expression that made my heart stutter. It wasn't the face of a 7-year-old. It was the face of someone who had seen a century of grief. "He doesn't have a story, Mom," he whispered. "He has a job. He knits the darkness together so he can walk through it without being seen." I felt a cold prickle of sweat on my neck. I tried to laugh it off, ruffled his hair, and told him to keep his knitting out of the kitchen. I assumed he'd seen something on a horror forum or a YouTube thumbnail. I was wrong. Over the next few days, the drawings began to move. In the first sketch, the Weaver was a tiny figure at the edge of the woods behind our backyard. In the next, he was standing on our porch, his long, thready fingers resting against the glass of the sliding door. By the end of that week, Silas drew him standing in our hallway, right outside his bedroom door. The atmosphere in the house began to rot. It's the only way I can describe it. The temperature plummeted, regardless of how high I turned the furnace. A faint, cloying scent began to hang in the air, a mix of old, dusty linen and wet, freshly turned earth. And then, Silas began to change. He was constantly, bone-wearily exhausted. Every morning, he looked as though he had run a marathon in his sleep. His skin turned a sickly, translucent pale, and heavy, purple circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. But it was his eyes themselves that truly terrified me. Every morning, I would wake him for school, and his pupils would be blown wide, fixed and dilated. Even in the harsh morning light of the kitchen, the black wells in his eyes wouldn't shrink. He would just stare at me, unblinking, his gaze hollowed out. "Silas, did you have another nightmare?" I asked, my voice trembling as I served his breakfast. "I didn't have a nightmare, Rhiannon," he said. He had stopped calling me Mom. "I just couldn't sleep. He needed them again." "Needed what, Silas?" "My eyes," he whispered, his spoon clinking against the ceramic bowl. "He doesn't have any of his own, so he has to borrow mine at night. He takes them so he can see where he's going. He shows me things, Rhiannon. He shows me the narrow spaces between the walls where the shadows breathe." I didn't wait for him to finish. I called the school and told them he was sick. I spent that afternoon scouring the house, looking for anything, a gas leak, a mold infestation, a squatter in the attic. I found nothing, but the feeling of being watched, of a cold, spindly presence hovering just behind my shoulder, never left me. That night, the horror finally broke the surface. I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. The air in my bedroom was so cold that my breath came out in thick, white clouds. The silence of the house was absolute, heavy, like I was buried under a mile of dirt. I walked into the hallway, my bare feet silent on the floorboards. I was heading for Silas's room, my maternal instincts screaming at me to check on him. I stopped 3 feet from his door. The air in the hallway felt thick. It was as if I were walking through invisible, sticky cobwebs that clung to my skin and hair. And there, looming right outside Silas's bedroom door, was a shadow. It wasn't a shadow cast by any furniture. It was a silhouette of pure, concentrated darkness. It reached all the way to the ceiling, its limbs bent at impossible, spider-like angles. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it. I could feel a cold, ancient hunger radiating from it. It was the Weaver. I didn't scream. My throat had closed up with terror. I lunged past the shadow into Silas's room, grabbed him out of his bed, and bolted. I didn't grab a coat. I didn't grab my shoes. I threw him into the back of the car and drove. I fled Savannah like the city was on fire. I drove 3 hours north through the pitch-black interstate, heading for my sister Vesper's house in Charleston. Silas didn't cry. He didn't even speak. He just sat in the back, his head lolling against the window, his dilated eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Vesper took us in without a word. She saw the state I was in, disheveled, barefoot, and hyperventilating. She locked every door, drew every curtain, and sat me down with a hot tea while Silas sat quietly at the kitchen counter. Finally, I felt a sliver of hope. We were in a different city. We were behind a deadbolt. The next morning, the sun was bright and the horror felt like a fever dream. I found Silas in the kitchen, peaceful, sketching on the back of a grocery receipt Vesper had left on the island. "Did you sleep better, Silas?" I asked, kissing his forehead. My heart finally began to slow down. "He's happy, Rhiannon," Silas said, his voice light and airy. He liked the ride. He said the trees looked beautiful through my eyes while we were on the highway. Every muscle in my body locked. I slowly reached for the receipt and turned it over. Silas had drawn Vesper's front door, the blue door with the brass knocker, and standing right in front of it, looming over the welcome mat, was the Weaver. But there was a new, agonizing detail. In this drawing, the Weaver wasn't eyeless anymore. He had 2 small, round, amber-colored eyes, the exact color of my son's eyes. Beneath the drawing, in a messy, aggressive scrawl that Silas hadn't mastered yet, were the words, "Thanks for the lift." I looked up, and I saw Vesper standing in the doorway. She was staring at Silas with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. "Rhiannon," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "Why is Silas's right eye turning gray?" I grabbed Silas and turned his face toward the light. My scream died in my throat. His right iris was fading, the warm amber color draining away like water into sand, until it was nothing but a cloudy, sightless, milky white. Silas didn't look scared. He looked hollow. "He said he's going to keep this one," Silas whispered, his voice sounding like a recording of a child rather than a child itself, "so he never gets lost again. He says he likes Vesper's attic. It's much bigger than ours." I am in this motel now. I checked Silas's eyes 5 minutes ago. His left eye is still amber, for now. But he's sitting on the floor, drawing again. He's drawing a map of every room in this motel. And in every room, he's drawing a tall, spindly figure, waiting for the sun to go down so it can see through the only eye it has left. They say the human brain remains active for approximately 7 minutes after the heart stops beating. 7 minutes of neurons firing in a desperate, final attempt to make sense of a life that is rapidly fading into static. I've been wondering, if those 7 minutes feel like an eternity, what does a month feel like? My name is Cassian Thorne. According to the world, I died on the night of October 14th. According to my watch, I woke up on November 15th. I am a land surveyor by trade. I'm used to isolation. I'm used to the silence of the Michigan wilderness, where the pines grow so thick they swallow the sunlight, and the wind off Lake Superior sounds like a chorus of grieving women. But nothing in my professional life prepared me for the night the loop began. It was a Tuesday, a brutal, rain-lashed Tuesday. I was finishing a survey of a private timber lot near the edge of the Huron Mountains. The storm was rolling in fast, turning the forest floor into a sludge of black mud and rotted leaves. I was hiking back to my truck when I saw the light, a pale, flickering glow through the trees. Not a flashlight, a lantern. I should have kept walking. I should have climbed into my Ford and driven back to Marquette without looking back. But curiosity is a persistent ghost. I crept through the brush, my boots sinking into the muck, until I reached a clearing. There was a man there. He was wearing a heavy, oil-stained yellow slicker. He was standing over a hole in the earth, his back to me. He was rhythmically tossing shovelfuls of dirt into the pit. Beside him lay a long, lumpy shape wrapped in a gray tarp. My heart hammered against my ribs. I thought I was witnessing a disposal, a murder. I reached for my phone, my fingers numb with cold, but as the screen lit up, a twig snapped under my heel. The man froze. He didn't turn around slowly. He moved with a practiced, lethal efficiency. Before I could even draw a breath to scream, he had drawn a pistol from beneath his slicker. I caught a glimpse of his face under the hood. He looked exhausted. He looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. His eyes were a sunken, watery blue. Eyes I recognized with a jolt of primal terror, though I couldn't place why. "I'm sorry, Cassian," he whispered. His voice was a raspy, broken mirror of my own. "It's the only way to keep the line straight." Then came the flash, a searing, white-hot roar that obliterated the world. I felt the impact at the base of my skull. I felt the wet heat of my own blood spraying into the cold rain. And then there was the dirt. I woke up screaming, but my mouth was filled with grit. My lungs burned as I clawed upward through a crushing weight of earth. It was pitch black. The air was thin and tasted of minerals and decay. I dug like an animal, my fingernails tearing against stones and roots until my hand finally broke the surface. I dragged myself out of the shallow grave, gasping for the freezing Michigan air. The storm had passed. The forest was silent, dusted with the first light frost of November. I checked my phone. The screen was shattered, but the internal clock flickered to life. November 15th, 3:42 a.m. 31 days had passed. I reached back to touch the spot where the bullet had entered my skull. My fingers met smooth, unscarred skin. There was no hole. There was no dried blood. My clothes were the same ones I had been wearing, muddied, torn, but miraculously intact. I was a dead man who had spent a month underground, yet I felt more alive than I ever had. My senses were hyper-acute. I could hear the heartbeat of a squirrel in a tree 50 yards away. I could smell the metallic tang of iron in the soil. I hiked back to where I had parked my truck. It was gone. In its place was a patch of tall grass that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in weeks. I walked. I walked for hours until I reached the main road, and eventually a gas station on the outskirts of Big Bay. The man behind the counter looked at me like I was a specter. He dropped the coffee pot he was holding. "Cassian?" he stammered. "Cassian Thorne? They held a memorial for you 3 weeks ago. They found your truck abandoned by the lake. They said you must have fallen in." I didn't answer. I just walked to the back of the store and looked at a newspaper. November 15th, 2026. I wasn't just missing. I was a ghost. I didn't go to the police. Something in my gut, something cold and ancient, told me that the law couldn't help a man who had been shot in the head and walked away from it. I went to the only place I had left, my home. A small, cedar-shingled cabin 10 miles north of the town. I approached the cabin through the woods, keeping to the shadows. The lights were on. Smoke was curling from the chimney. My truck, the one that was supposedly missing, was parked in the driveway. I peered through the window of my own living room. The man in the yellow slicker was there. He had taken it off. He was sitting in my armchair, drinking from my favorite mug. He looked older than me, maybe by 15 or 20 years, but the resemblance was undeniable. He was me, but he wasn't alone. Standing in the kitchen, making coffee, was another version of me. This one looked exactly like I did the night I was shot. Young, vibrant, unaware. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a loop, it was a factory. I waited until the older version, the slicker, went into the back bedroom. I watched through the glass as the current me sat down at the table, looking at a map of the Huron Mountains. He was planning the survey. He was planning the walk that would lead him to his death. I knew what I had to do. I didn't enter the house. I went back to the clearing in the woods. I went back to the spot where I had clawed my way out of the earth. I began to dig. I didn't have a shovel, so I used a flat stone in my bare hands. I dug until the sun began to rise, and then I hit something hard. Something plastic. I pulled back the dirt and found a gray tarp. My hands shook as I unzipped it. Inside was a body. It was me. But it wasn't the me that had just woken up. This corpse was in a state of advanced decomposition. Its skull was shattered by a high-caliber bullet. In its pocket, I found a wallet. Inside the wallet was a driver's license for Cassian Thorne. Underneath that body was another tarp. And another. A stack of corpses, all wearing the same clothes, all with the same bullet hole, piled up like cordwood in a forgotten corner of Michigan. I realized then the horrific geometry of my existence. The slicker wasn't a murderer. He was a harvester. Every 30 days, a new Cassian was generated, perhaps by the soil, perhaps by the woods, perhaps by something deeper. And every 30 days, the older version had to retire the current version to make room for the next. If he didn't, the world would be filled with us. The paradox would tear the town apart. I sat on the edge of the grave, looking at the sunrise. I felt the weight of the pistol in my hand, a gun I didn't remember carrying, but one that was now tucked into my waistband as if it had always been there. I walked back to the cabin. I didn't kill the younger me. Not yet. I waited until the slicker came out to the porch to smoke. He saw me standing at the edge of the trees. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded, a weary, resigned movement of his head. "You're early," he said. "How many times?" I asked. "I've buried 12 of you," he replied, "and I've been buried by 3. It's a heavy cycle, Cassian. But the woods, they demand a surveyor. They demand someone to mark the boundaries between what is real and what is not." He handed me the yellow slicker. It felt like lead in my hands. "The next one comes in 30 days, he said. "He'll be hiking the timber lot. He'll see your lantern. You know the clearing. You know the spot." He walked toward the grave I had dug. He lay down in the dirt, closing his eyes. "Make it clean," he whispered. "I'm tired of being the one who remembers." I raised the gun. I looked at the man who was me, who would be me, and who had already been me. Bang. I buried him. I filled the hole with the black Michigan mud and covered it with pine needles. I am now living in the cabin. I drink the coffee. I look at the maps. I watch the younger version of myself through the window, watching him live a life that is already over. I have 28 days left before I have to go to the woods. I am writing this on a small piece of parchment tucked into the lining of the yellow slicker. If you are reading this, if you are the Cassian who just woke up in the dirt, I have only one piece of advice. Don't try to run. I tried. The woods just bring you back to the clearing. Instead, look at the stars tonight. Really look at them. They are the only thing in this world that isn't a loop. See you in the clearing, Cassian. There is a particular kind of greed that bypasses the survival instinct. It is the kind of greed that makes a man ignore the barbed wire, the blacked-out windows, and the non-disclosure agreements that read more like death warrants. My name is Vane Sterling, and I was that man. When the recruitment firm contacted me for a sanitation and logistics position within a restricted zone of the Gila National Forest in New Mexico, I didn't ask about the high mortality insurance. I only saw the monthly salary, $20,000, deposited into an offshore account, no questions asked. The official narrative was a familiar one, polished by government PR firms until it shone with a dull bureaucratic luster. They called it Project Verdant. The story told to the public was that a clandestine laboratory, a remnant of the Cold War hidden deep within the Gila wilderness, had suffered a catastrophic containment breach of experimental defoliants. The soil was toxic, the air was caustic, and the entire sector, a 60-mile radius of jagged canyons and ancient ponderosa pines, was quarantined for the safety of the American people. I arrived at the perimeter in the dead of a moonless October night. The fence was the first thing that felt wrong. It wasn't just a chain-link barrier. It was a colossal structure of reinforced steel and copper mesh, humming with a low-frequency vibration that made the teeth in my skull ache. It stood 30 feet high, topped with motion-sensing turrets that tracked my transport vehicle with a mechanical, predatory precision. My supervisor was a man named Overseer Malthus. He was a creature of sharp angles and bleached skin, eyes hidden behind mirrored aviators even in the pitch darkness of the forest. He handed me my equipment, a pressurized hazmat suit, a heavy industrial vacuum, and a set of magnetic keycards. "Your job is simple, Sterling," Malthus said, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering over pavement. "You clean the runoff. You do not talk to the technical teams. You do not look at the monitors in the central hub. And most importantly, you do not cross the yellow lines in the lower strata of the gorge." For the first 2 months, the work was mind-numbingly monotonous. Every morning, I was escorted by silent men in charcoal-colored tactical gear to a series of concrete bunkers built into the side of a limestone cliff. My task was to vacuum up a viscous silver-black residue that pooled on the floors of the airlocks. It had the weight of mercury, but a scent that bypassed the filters of my suit, a cloying, metallic stench of ozone and sun-baked copper. I was a ghost in a machine of ghosts. The technical teams, men and women in white level-A biosuits, moved with a synchronized, ritualistic efficiency. They never spoke. They only communicated through complex hand signals. Every Tuesday, a convoy of unmarked black trucks would arrive at the facility. They didn't bring barrels of neutralizing agents or scientific equipment. They brought long, rectangular crates that required 6 men to carry. crates that were ventilated, crates that occasionally shifted with an internal, frantic weight. My suspicion didn't begin with a grand revelation. It began with the silence. In a forest as vast as the Gila, there should be life. Even in a disaster zone, there should be the movement of scavengers, the rustle of wind through dead needles. But inside Sector 0, the atmosphere was pressurized. It was as if the air itself was being held in place by an unseen hand. In the third month, curiosity finally overrode my fear. I had been assigned to clean the peripheral corridors of the sanitation hub, a sector adjacent to the main gorge. Malthus and the tactical teams were occupied with the arrival of a high-priority consignment. I waited until the rhythmic vibration of the perimeter fence spiked, a sign that the power was being diverted to the lower levels, and I used a modified bypass key I had cobbled together from salvaged electronics. I entered the central monitoring station. The room was bathed in a sickly crimson light. Rows of monitors lined the walls, but they weren't displaying chemical readouts or toxicity levels. They were displaying a hole. A massive, perfectly circular shaft had been bored into the floor of the Gila Canyon. It was miles deep, a throat of darkness lined with glowing, violet geometric patterns that seemed to pulse in time with the vibration of the fence. Around the rim of this abyss, the government hadn't built a laboratory. They had built a cathedral. I saw footage from the lower depths. The hazmat teams weren't scientists, they were acolytes. I watched as they opened the ventilated crates. Out stumbled people, men and women in orange jumpsuits, their eyes clouded with heavy sedation. But they weren't being experimented on in any medical sense. Their skin had been etched with the same violet geometric patterns I saw on the walls of the shaft. The chemical spill was a lie. There were no defoliants. The military had discovered something ancient beneath the New Mexico soil, something that had been dreaming since before the mountains were formed. And they weren't trying to study it. They were trying to wake it up. A sudden movement on the peripheral monitors caught my eye. A group of people, perhaps a dozen, had broken free from the holding pens in the lower strata. They weren't running toward the exit. They were running toward the camera, their faces contorted in a mixture of agony and religious ecstasy. They weren't wearing jumpsuits anymore. Their skin had been flayed in precise, ritualistic strips, revealing the muscle beneath in a pattern that mirrored the violet glyphs. They didn't scream for help. They didn't beg for mercy. I watched their lips move in the graininess of the security footage. They were repeating a single phrase over and over again, a rhythmic chant that seemed to make the very glass of the monitors vibrate. The door to the monitoring station hissed open. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Overseer Malthus stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his glasses. Where his eyes should have been, there was only a swirling violet nebulae, a reflection of the abyss in the gorge. "You weren't supposed to see the architect, Vane," Malthus said. His voice was no longer a rasp. It was a chorus of 1,000 voices, echoing from the depths of the earth. "The spill is a metaphor. We are merely cleaning the way for a more permanent reality." "You're killing them," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Those people, you're sacrificing them." "Sacrifice is a primitive word," Malthus replied, stepping into the room. His movements were no longer human. He glided with a fluid, terrifying grace. "We are providing anchors. The architect requires a bridge of consciousness to cross into this sphere. Blood is the conductor. Pain is the frequency. We are merely the engineers of the inevitable." A deafening resonance shook the facility, a soundless pressure that shattered the glass of the monitors. In the gorge below, the violet glyphs flared with a blinding, impossible light. I felt a searing pain at the base of my spine, a sensation of being pulled toward the floor. "The fence," I gasped, realizing the truth. The humming, The copper mesh, it's not to keep people out. It is a giant antenna, Malthus smiled, revealing rows of teeth that were far too many for a human mouth. It focuses the collective fear of the world into this single point. And you, Vane, you have been breathing the residue for months. You have been marinated in the architect's essence. I lunged past him, driven by a primal blind panic. I didn't head for the exit, I headed for the service tunnels. I knew the layout of the upper levels better than anyone. I tore through the hazmat suit, the pressurized air hissing out as I stripped down to my base layers. I needed to be fast. I needed to be invisible. As I ran through the concrete corridors, the facility began to transform. The walls weren't limestone and rebar anymore. They were becoming translucent, revealing the jagged black veins of the mountain. I saw the tactical teams. They weren't guarding the halls, they were kneeling, their foreheads pressed against the vibrating floor, their bodies dissolving into the same silver-black residue I had spent months cleaning. I reached the perimeter. The steel and copper fence was glowing a brilliant, lethal blue. The turrets were firing, but not at me. They were firing into the air, as if trying to strike down the very stars themselves. I found a drainage pipe that led out under the fence, a narrow conduit for the runoff. I crawled through the silver-black sludge, the metallic stench burning my lungs, my skin blistering where it touched the residue. I didn't care. I pushed through the darkness, the sound of the chanting from the hub echoing in my skull, until I tumbled out onto the dry, needle-strewn floor of the forest outside the quarantine zone. I ran until my legs gave out, until the sunrise began to bleed over the horizon. I made it to the highway. I hitched a ride with a trucker who didn't ask about the chemical burns on my arms or the way my eyes wouldn't stop twitching. I made it to a motel in Albuquerque, then a bus to the coast. I changed my name. I moved every 2 weeks. I thought I had escaped. But the greed of the architect is more persistent than the greed of man. It has been 1 year since I left the Gila National Forest. The government officially closed Project Verdant, claiming the spill had been successfully neutralized and the site entombed in concrete. They moved on. The world forgot. But I cannot forget. Every night, exactly at the hour I first crossed the fence, the vibration returns. I don't hear it with my ears. I feel it in my bones. I look in the mirror and I see the violet geometric patterns beginning to itch beneath the surface of my skin. And last night, as I sat in the darkness of my room, I heard a soundless pressure against the window. I didn't look, but I smelled it. The cloying, metallic scent of ozone and sun-baked copper. A voice, a chorus of 1,000 voices, whispered from the air vents. The bridge is almost complete, Vane. We just need the final anchor to come home. I am looking at my hands now. The skin is becoming translucent. I can see the blue-black network of veins, and I can see the silver-black residue beginning to leak from my pores. I am not a survivor. I was never a janitor. I was just the container, and the architect is finally ready to pour.